The battlefield was a graveyard of fire and metal. Smoke curled into the toxic sky as explosions shook the ground, sending debris and charred bodies flying. Captain Elias Carter pushed forward, his rifle clutched tight in his hands, sweat and blood trickling down his forehead. His squad was scattered, their voices crackling through his comms, filled with fear, pain, and the desperate need to survive. But deep down, they all knew the truth. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Dravos 9 had been the last stronghold in this sector, a human colony fortified to withstand anything the Excelsior Empire could throw at it. The war had raged for years, but no one had expected the enemy to deploy orbital bombardment. They hadn't even given a warning. One moment, the colony stood proud. The next, it was a smoldering ruin. Elias dove behind the wreckage of a fallen dropship, his heart pounding as an enemy scout drone hovered nearby, its glowing red eye sweeping over the ruins. He held his breath, the heat of his rifle burning against his gloved fingers. The second it turned away, he moved, silent, precise, a soldier trained to survive against impossible odds. He had to find the others. Carter, do you copy? A familiar voice rasped in his ear. Elias pressed his earpiece. Bonner, where the hell are you? Pinned near the command center. Those AI bastards are cutting through our defenses. It's bad, man. We gotta. The transmission cut off in a burst of static. Elias gritted his teeth. He had fought beside Sergeant Bonner for 6 years. The man was more than a squad mate. He was a brother. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the remains of the command center, weaving through the ruins, his boots crunching over broken glass and scorched metal. The air reeked of death. Bodies, human and alien, lay scattered, some still clutching their weapons, others torn apart by plasma fire. A shadow loomed ahead. Elias froze, pressing himself against the wreckage. A Excelsior war machine. The towering mech moved with deadly grace, its sleek, black armor lined with pulsating blue energy. Its eye-controlled turrets scanned the ruins, searching for survivors. One wrong move, and Elias would be vaporized. Sweat dripped down his face as he waited, barely breathing. The moment it turned, he bolted, ducking, rolling, weaving through the destruction. He was close. He could see the collapsed remains of the command center now, fire licking at the shattered walls. Then he saw him. Bonner was slumped against a fallen pillar, his rifle limp in his hands. A deep plasma wound had burned through his chest. His breath was ragged, shallow. He wasn't going to make it. Elias skidded to his knees, gripping his friend's vest. "Hold on, buddy. We're getting out of here." Bonner's eyes flickered open, a weak smile tugging at his lips. "Not this time, you stubborn bastard." He coughed, blood staining his teeth. Elias shook his head, his throat tight. "I won't leave you here. Then you'll die too." Bonner's grip on his arm weakened. His voice was barely a whisper now. "Get out of here, Carter. Live. For both of us." A deafening explosion shook the ground. More Excelsior forces were closing in. The mech turned, its scanners locking onto their position. Elias had no choice. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to step back. Bonner's eyes met his one last time. A silent goodbye. Then the mech fired. A blinding flash, a deafening roar. Bonner was gone. Elias was thrown back by the blast, his ears ringing, his vision blurred. Pain shot through his ribs, his legs barely able to move. But he wasn't dead. Not yet. Somehow, he forced himself up, stumbling through the ruins like a ghost. His squad was gone. His mission was over. There was no one left to save. That's when he saw her. She was barely visible beneath the rubble, her body half buried in debris. Purple blood stained her silver armor, her breathing faint. A Excelsior warrior, but not like the others. Her features were more delicate, her form built for agility rather than brute strength. Her armor flickered with failing cloaking technology, a sign that she was meant to be unseen. She was dying. abandoned by her own people. Elias should have walked away. She was the enemy, after all. But as he stared at her, broken and alone, something inside him shifted. He had just watched his best friend die, his squad wiped out. He knew what it felt like to be left behind. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was madness. But Elias made a choice. He moved toward her, ignoring the screams of his own injuries. Carefully, he pried the rubble off her, lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her breath shallow against his neck. Her silver eyes fluttered open for a brief second, confusion and pain clouding them. She tried to speak, but no words came. Then she passed out. Elias adjusted his grip and took a shaky step forward. The Excelsior were still hunting. The war wasn't over. And now he had a new mission. Survive, protect her, and find out why the hell he just staved an enemy soldier. Elias pushed through the ruins, his arms burning as he carried the wounded alien girl across the battlefield. Smoke curled into the sky, the air thick with the scent of charred metal and death. Every step sent pain shooting up his legs, his injuries catching up to him. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The Excelsior war machines were still sweeping the area, hunting for survivors. If he stopped now, they were both dead. The girl's body was light, almost too light, as if her bones were made for speed rather than brute strength. Blood, a deep shade of violet, trickled from a wound on her side, staining his already ruined armor. She was breathing, but barely. He didn't even know why he had saved her. She was the enemy, the same species that had wiped out his squad without a second thought. The same ones responsible for Bonner's death. He should have left her there, but something in him refused. Maybe it was because she had been left behind, just like he had. He reached the remains of an abandoned outpost, its structure barely intact, walls cracked and scorched. It was dangerous to stop here, but he needed cover. With careful movements, he lowered her onto the cold metal floor, propping her up against a broken console. His body screamed in protest, every muscle aching from exhaustion and blood loss. He had lost count of how many wounds he had. All he knew was that he was still alive. The girl stirred, a low, pained groan escaping her lips. Elias tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. He didn't know how she would react once she woke up. She was Excelsior, trained to kill humans. And here he was, the only human around. Her silver eyes fluttered open, hazy with pain and confusion. For a moment, she didn't move, her gaze unfocused. Then, realization hit. She lunged. Elias barely had time to react before she was on him, her hands gripping his throat, her strength shocking despite her injuries. He gritted his teeth, grabbing her wrists, trying to pry them off, but her grip was strong, too strong for someone on the brink of death. Her breath was ragged, her body trembling, but her eyes burned with fury. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, weak, but filled with hostility. Elias growled, twisting free and shoving her back against the console. "I just saved your damn life, and this is the thanks I get." She gasped for breath, her hands pressing against her wounded side. Blood seeped between her fingers, her strength faltering for a second. But her glare never wavered. "You should have let me die, human." Elias scoffed, rubbing his sore neck. "Trust me, I considered it." He grabbed his rifle from the floor and aimed it at her, his finger resting on the trigger. "Now tell me, why were you left behind?" She hesitated. He saw it in her eyes, the flicker of something deeper, shame, anger. He wasn't sure. Then she clenched her jaw. "My unit was ambushed during the attack. I was wounded. They deemed me useless." Elias exhaled slowly. He knew that Excelsior were ruthless, but abandoning their own, that was a level of cruelty even he hadn't expected. She shifted, wincing in pain, and leaned against the wall. "You're wasting your time keeping me alive." Elias narrowed his eyes. Yeah, well, I don't plan on dying alone, sweetheart. And right now, you're the only company I've got. She gave him a sharp look, her expression unreadable. Silence stretched between them, the only sound the distant rumble of explosions. Then she spoke. My name is Lyra. Elias hesitated. Elias Carter. Neither of them reached out for a handshake. Instead, Elias sighed and lowered his rifle. Look, I don't trust you, and I know damn well you don't trust me. But the Excelsior are still out there, and if they find us, we're both dead. So, unless you want to bleed out here, we need to work together. Lyra's jaw tightened. I don't ally with humans. Elias smirked. You'd rather ally with the bastards who left you to die. Her eyes flickered with something. Hurt, maybe, but she didn't answer. Elias took that as a small victory. He grabbed his pack and pulled out a field medkit. Hold still. She eyed him warily. What are you doing? Stopping you from dying, genius. He pulled out a disinfectant injector and pressed it against her wound. She flinched as it hissed, the pain evident on her face, but she didn't complain. He worked quickly, wrapping a bandage around her side, his fingers brushing against her smooth, silvery skin. It was strange, seeing an alien up close like this. She looked so human, yet everything about her, from her slightly elongated limbs to the faint bioluminescent lines tracing her collarbone, was different. When he was done, he leaned back. There, you'll live. She looked at the bandage, then at him. You're a fool. Elias smirked. Been called worse. Before she could respond, a metallic screech echoed through the ruins. Elias' blood ran cold. The Excelsior war machines were near. He grabbed his rifle and peered through a broken window. Shadows moved through the smoke, tall, sleek figures with glowing eyes. Eye-controlled hunters. Lyra stiffened. They're searching for survivors. Elias didn't take his eyes off them. Then we better make sure they don't find us. She looked at him, something unreadable in her gaze. Then, slowly, she nodded. For the first time, they were on the same side. Elias gripped his rifle tight, his heartbeat hammering in his ears as the mechanical screeches echoed through the ruins. The Excelsior war machines were closing in, their sleek metallic bodies moving with an eerie precision through the smoke-filled landscape. Their glowing red optics cut through the darkness like hunting beacons. He turned to Lyra. Her silver eyes flickered with a mix of pain and urgency. She might have been wounded, but she wasn't weak. She pressed her hand against her side, wincing, but the resolve on her face was clear. She wasn't going to let herself be captured. Can you move? Elias whispered. She shot him a glare but gave a small nod. I'll manage. They didn't have a choice. Staying here meant death. Elias pressed himself against the cracked wall of the outpost, peeking through a gap. The war machines were scanning the area, their sharp, insect-like limbs clicking against the rubble as they moved. They were designed for hunting. If one spotted them, it wouldn't stop until they were dead. Lyra shifted beside him. We need a distraction, she murmured. Elias frowned. Unless you have a grenade hidden somewhere, I don't see how we're gonna distract a damn death squad. Her gaze flicked to a fallen Excelsior soldier a few meters away. The corpse was still clutching the plasma rifle. Cover me, she said. Before he could protest, she darted forward, swift despite her injuries. Are you serious? Elias hissed, but there was no time to stop her. She slid to the corpse, snatching the rifle, her fingers working quickly over its settings. A beeping sound activated. Elias' eyes widened. Tell me you didn't just. Lyra hurled the rifle toward the opposite side of the ruins, just as the war machines turned toward the sound. The moment it hit the ground, it exploded in a burst of violet energy, sending debris flying. The war machines twisted their heads toward the blast. Their optics flashed as they adjusted their scans, drawn toward the disturbance. Elias didn't hesitate. Move. They sprinted through the ruins, weaving between broken structures and burned-out vehicles. Every step sent jolts of pain through Elias' body, but he pushed forward. There was no room for weakness. Lyra kept pace beside him, her breathing sharp and uneven. Blood still seeped from her wound, but she didn't slow down. Elias had to admit, for someone who had just tried to kill him an hour ago, she was damn resilient. The war machines detected movement. A shriek filled the air. Elias risked a glance over his shoulder. One of the hunters had locked onto them. Its sleek, metallic body blurred as it shot forward, its bladed arms slicing through rubble like paper. Faster, Elias shouted. Liara didn't need to be told twice. A beam of red energy shot past them, barely missing Elias' shoulder. They weren't going to outrun it. His eyes darted around, searching. There. A collapsed highway up ahead. The twisted remains of a transport truck jutted from the wreckage, forming a small tunnel. This way. He grabbed Lyara's wrist, pulling her toward the opening. Just as they dove inside, the hunter lunged. Its bladed arms swiped through the air, missing Elias by inches. Sparks flew as its claws scraped against the metal entrance, but its body was too large to fit inside. For now, they were safe. Elias gasped for breath, pressing his back against the cold metal. Lyra sat beside him, clutching her side. Sweat dripped down her forehead, but her expression was calm. That was reckless, Elias muttered. She smirked weakly. It worked. He exhaled. Yeah, barely. Outside, the war machine let out a mechanical hiss. It wasn't leaving. It was waiting. We need to keep moving, Lyra whispered. Elias nodded. He peeked out through a gap in the wreckage. More war machines were arriving. Their red optics flickered as they communicated silently. His stomach sank. They were being surrounded. We won't last long if we're trapped, Elias murmured. Lyra's gaze hardened. Then we fight our way out. Elias scoffed. Right. You with a single plasma rifle, and me, running low on ammo, against an army of war machines. Her smirk was almost amused. You have a better idea. He glanced at the war machines again, analyzing their movements. Their scanning patterns were precise, systematic. But there was always a gap, a fraction of a second where their vision reset before shifting positions. Elias had learned one thing in war. No machine was perfect. He tightened his grip on his rifle. We wait for an opening. Lyra gave a small nod. For once, she didn't argue. Minutes passed. Each second stretched into eternity. The war machines moved in calculated motions, sweeping the area, searching for signs of life. Then, the moment came. Now. They burst from the wreckage, moving fast. Elias fired first, his bullets slamming into the optic sensors of the nearest war machine. Sparks flew as it staggered back, momentarily blinded. Lyra fired next. Her plasma bolt struck another machine in the joint, severing its leg. It collapsed with a metallic screech. They ran. The war machines reacted instantly. Red beams shot through the air, burning into the rubble around them. Elias ducked, barely avoiding a blast that vaporized the ground behind him. The exit was close, just a little further. Then everything went wrong. Lyra suddenly stopped. Elias skidded to a halt. What are you doing? Keep moving. Her silver eyes locked onto something ahead. Elias followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Zelzor soldiers. A full squad. Heavily armed. And they weren't here to rescue her. They had their weapons drawn, aimed directly at her. Elias tensed, raising his rifle, but Lyra didn't move. One of the Zelzor, clad in a commander's uniform, stepped forward. His violet skin shimmered under the glow of the war machines. His expression was unreadable. Lyra, he said, voice cold. You are under arrest for treason. Elias' grip tightened on his gun. Treason. Lyra didn't react. Her face was unreadable, but her hands curled into fists. Elias took a step forward. The hell is this? The commander's gaze flicked to him. You, the human. You've interfered enough. Surrender now, and we may let you live." Elias snorted. "Yeah, that's not happening." The soldiers raised their rifles. Tension crackled in the air. Elias glanced at Lyra. "You planned on telling me about this." Her jaw clenched. "I didn't think I'd survive long enough for it to matter." Elias cursed under his breath. This wasn't just an escape anymore. This was a damn execution. And Lyra was caught in the middle. Her own people had abandoned her. Now they were here to finish the job. She turned to Elias, her voice barely above a whisper. "Run." He stared at her. "What?" She shoved him back. "I said run." The commander's voice rang out. "Take them both." Gunfire exploded. Elias had no time to think. Lyra lunged at her own people, her plasma rifle blazing. Elias turned and ran. Because if he stayed, they were both dead. And something told him this was far from over. Elias ran through the ruins, his breath ragged, heart pounding like a war drum in his chest. The night air was thick with the scent of burning metal and scorched earth, and every step he took sent dust and ash swirling around him. The distant echoes of gunfire and energy blasts faded behind him, but he knew better than to stop. He had left Lyra behind. The thought gnawed at him. He had no choice. If he had stayed, they both would have been killed or captured. But it still felt wrong. She had shoved him away, told him to run, to save himself. But had she really expected him to just leave her? He gritted his teeth. No, she wasn't dead. Not yet. Elias forced himself to focus. First, he needed a place to regroup, to think. He was low on ammo. His body ached from the endless running. And the Exilzor and their war machines were everywhere. If he wanted to save Lyra, he needed a plan. His eyes scanned the ruined city around him. The once mighty human colony was now nothing more than a graveyard of broken buildings and twisted steel. But then, he saw something. A flicker of movement in the shadows. He immediately raised his rifle, finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a voice whispered from the darkness. "Easy, human." A figure stepped forward. A tall, cloaked alien with deep-set golden eyes. His armor was old but sturdy, his body covered in scars. Not Exilzor. Elias didn't lower his gun. "Who the hell are you?" The alien studied him before answering. "Someone who wants the same thing you do, to see the Exilzor burn." Elias narrowed his eyes. "And why should I trust you?" The alien smirked. "Because right now, you don't have a choice." Elias hesitated, his instincts screaming not to trust a stranger, but he was out of options. The alien gestured for him to follow. "Come. We don't have long before the patrols circle back." Elias took a deep breath. Then, against all logic, he followed. The hideout was deep underground, hidden beneath the wreckage of an old transport station. The moment Elias stepped inside, he realized he wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of them, a ragtag group of different alien species, some wounded, others armed to the teeth, all of them with the same hardened look in their eyes. Survivors, rebels, fighters. Elias scanned the room, his grip on his rifle still tight. "What is this place?" The golden-eyed alien stood beside him. "A sanctuary. A resistance." Elias frowned. "Resistance." The alien nodded. "The Exilzor aren't as unstoppable as they want you to believe. Their rule is built on fear, not strength. They can be beaten." Elias scoffed. "Yeah, I haven't seen much proof of that." The alien's gaze darkened. "Then you haven't been looking in the right places." Before Elias could respond, a voice interrupted them. "You're the human who was with Lyra." Elias turned sharply. A female alien, tall and sharp-featured, stepped forward. Her piercing violet eyes locked onto him with an unreadable expression. Elias tensed. "You know Lyra." She crossed her arms. "She's my sister." Silence. Elias stared at her, disbelief flickering through him. Lyra had a sister. The woman studied him carefully. She's alive. The XL Zor have her. Elias clenched his fists. He had already suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a fresh wave of anger through him. We have to get her back, he said. The woman's expression didn't change. You think that's easy? The XL Zor don't take prisoners unless they have a reason. If they kept her alive, it means they see her as valuable. Elias frowned. Then we use that against them. The golden-eyed alien nodded approvingly. You have the mind of a soldier. Good. Elias glanced at him. You still haven't told me your name. The alien gave a small smirk. Veros. Elias exhaled. All right, Veros. Tell me what we're dealing with. Veros motioned for him to follow. They moved deeper into the hideout, where a makeshift war table was set up, holographic maps, stolen Zor schematics, plans for an uprising. Elias listened carefully as Veros explained. The XL Zor stronghold was heavily fortified, crawling with war machines and elite guards. Breaking in was nearly impossible, unless they had an inside man. Elias' mind raced. What if we could create a diversion? Something big enough to draw their forces away, even for a few minutes. Veros stroked his chin. A coordinated attack. Elias nodded. Give me a small team. Get me inside. I'll handle the rest. Lyra's sister spoke up. You're willing to risk your life for her. Elias met her gaze. She saved mine. The woman studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. Then I'll help you. Elias exhaled. They had a plan. Now they just had to survive long enough to pull it off. That night, Elias sat alone, cleaning his rifle. His mind was restless. Lyra was still out there. He couldn't let her die. Footsteps approached. He glanced up to see her sister watching him. You care about her. Elias didn't respond immediately. Then, quietly, he said, Yeah. The woman sat down across from him. Lyra doesn't trust easily. If she let you in, it means something. Elias looked at her. I won't let her down. For the first time, the woman gave a small smile. Then we fight together. Elias nodded. Tomorrow, they would strike. Tomorrow, they would bring her back. The night was silent, but Elias knew it was the kind of silence that only came before a storm. His grip on his rifle was tight, his muscles coiled with tension as he crouched behind the ruined pillar, watching the XL Zor stronghold in the distance. The fortress loomed ahead, a towering monstrosity of dark metal and glowing energy barriers, pulsing with alien technology. Somewhere inside, Lyra was being held prisoner. The resistance had spent the last 24 hours preparing for this moment. Every weapon checked, every route mapped, every risk calculated. There was no room for failure. Veros crouched beside Elias, his golden eyes gleaming in the low light. We don't have long, he whispered. The XL Zor cycles are predictable. In 5 minutes, their sentries rotate. That's our opening. Elias nodded. And the diversion, already in place. On cue, an explosion rocked the far side of the stronghold. A ball of fire erupted into the sky, sending metal and debris flying. The alarm klaxons blared, red lights flashing as Zor warriors rushed toward the disturbance. Elias didn't hesitate. Move. He sprinted forward, the other rebels right behind him. The ground was uneven, littered with the wreckage of past battles, but his focus was razor-sharp. Every step brought him closer to Lyra. They'd reached the outer wall just as planned. Veros placed a small device against the surface, and with a low hum, the cloaking field shimmered and collapsed, revealing the hidden maintenance hatch. Go, 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 Veros urged. Elias slid through first, rifle up, scanning the corridor. The inside of the fortress was cold, sterile, every inch lined with that eerie, unnatural XL Zor glow. The air was thick with the hum of alien energy flowing through the walls. Veros and the others followed, sealing the hatch behind them. "We split here," Veros whispered. "We'll draw their attention deeper into the fortress. You get to Lara." Elias met his gaze. "Don't die." Veros smirked. "I make no promises." Then he was gone, leading the others down the corridor. Elias turned the opposite way, moving quickly, his footsteps silent. Every corner was a risk, every hallway a potential death trap. He saw 2 Selzor soldiers guarding a door ahead. He didn't slow down. 2 shots. One to the throat, the other to the head. Both Selzor dropped before they even realized they were under attack. Elias reached the door, his heart pounding. He placed his hand on the scanner. Nothing. Locked. Damn it. He grabbed one of the dead Selzor, pressing its clawed hand against the panel. The door hissed open. Inside, Lara was chained to a chair, her face bruised, her silver-blue skin marked with cuts. Her glowing violet eyes widened when she saw him. "Elias." Her voice was hoarse. "No time." He rushed forward, slicing through her restraints with his combat knife. She swayed, weak, but he caught her. "Can you walk?" "I don't think I have a choice," she murmured. Elias slung her arm over his shoulder and guided her to the door. That was when the alarms changed. The fortress trembled. A new siren wailed. A different pitch, more urgent. They'd been discovered. Elias gritted his teeth. Hold on. They moved fast, but not fast enough. A squad of Selzor warriors blocked the exit. The lead soldier tilted its head, its deep, mechanical voice echoing through the corridor. "Foolish human. Did you think we wouldn't be prepared for your kind?" Elias pulled the trigger. The corridor erupted into chaos. Blaster fire filled the space, energy rounds sizzling through the air. Elias dove behind cover, pulling Lara down with him. He returned fire, his shots precise, dropping 2 enemies before they could react. Lara reached for a fallen Selzor's weapon, her fingers shaky but determined. She wasn't at full strength, but she was still a fighter. She fired, taking down another enemy. Elias saw an opening. Now. They sprinted through the breach, their boots pounding against the metal floor. The battle outside was raging. Veros and the resistance were holding their ground, but it was clear that Selzor were relentless. Elias saw their only way out, a transport docked at the far end of the courtyard. If they could get to it, they had a chance. Lara stumbled, but Elias caught her again. Almost there. Selzor war machines roared to life, towering metal constructs with heavy plasma cannons. Elias cursed, "Get to the ship." Lara hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you." She nodded reluctantly and ran for the ramp. Elias turned back, his rifle raised. The war machines locked onto him. Too late to run. A deafening roar filled the air. Veros charging in with his fighters. They unleashed everything they had. Explosives, heavy weapons, sheer rage. The war machines staggered, their targeting disrupted. Elias sprinted after Lara, jumping onto the ship just as she activated the controls. The engines roared to life. Veros glanced at him from the battlefield, giving him a nod before turning back to fight. Elias slammed his fist against the cockpit glass. Veros. But there was no turning back now. The ship lifted off. Selzor forces swarmed below, firing wildly, but it was too late. They were airborne, streaking into the sky, leaving the battlefield behind. Elias exhaled, finally allowing himself to breathe. He turned to Lara. She was staring at him, her violet eyes shimmering with emotion. "You came for me," she whispered. He nodded. "I wasn't going to lose you." She reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "You didn't." Below them, the war raged on. But up here, for the first time in a long time, Elias felt like they had won. The days after their escape were a blur of endless travel. Elias kept his focus on the mission, knowing that the Selzor would not stop hunting them. He had learned to live with the urgency, the constant tension of being one step ahead of the enemy. The ship they had stolen was fast, But the Excelsior had advanced technology, and their reach was vast. Every time the ship's sensors beeped, Elias' heart would race. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not for a second. Liara had been silent for most of their journey, her strength gradually returning but still fragile. The rescue had drained her, physically and emotionally. She had been through hell. And now, being free of the Excelsior's hold, she was still adjusting to this new reality. Elias knew better than to push her. Liara. He called softly one morning as the stars passed by, the ship's hum providing the only sound. How are you feeling today? She sat in the corner of the small, dimly lit cabin, staring out into the endless expanse of space. Her silvery blue skin was pale, and her violet eyes seemed distant. For the first time in what felt like forever, she looked vulnerable. I'm not sure, she admitted, her voice quiet. I've never been this free before, and it feels overwhelming. Elias leaned against the wall, his gaze softening. It's okay. You don't have to be anything right now. Just take it one day at a time. She turned to him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find something in his expression. You saved me, she whispered. Elias smiled, though it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was the kind of smile that came from deep understanding, from knowing what it was like to fight for survival, to risk everything for someone you cared about. He stepped forward, standing just a few feet away. I didn't save you because I had to, he said quietly. I saved you because I couldn't leave you behind. Liara swallowed, the weight of his words settling between them like a thick fog. She had heard soldiers speak of duty before, of honor and courage. But this was different. Elias wasn't speaking from a place of obligation. He was speaking from his heart. Without another word, she stood and walked over to him, her movements slow but steady. Her hand reached up, gently touching his chest. The softness of her touch sent a shiver through Elias' body, but he remained still, allowing her to take the lead. I don't know how to thank you for this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For saving me, for bringing me to safety. Elias placed his hand over hers, the warmth of her touch grounding him. He had saved her, but in truth, she had saved him too. In the chaos of war, in the devastation of loss, he had found a connection with her, a connection that went beyond just survival. It was a bond forged in the fire of battle, a bond neither of them could ignore. You don't need to thank me, Elias said, his voice steady. You've already done more than enough just by being here. Liara's eyes glistened, and for the first time since their escape, she smiled, a smile so pure, so full of emotion. It made Elias' heart race. I didn't think anyone could care for me, she said softly, almost as if she were admitting a secret. The Excelsior never cared. I was just a weapon to them. A tool. And now, she paused, taking a breath. Now I feel something I haven't felt in years. I feel like I belong. Elias' chest tightened, and he could feel his own emotions surging. He had never been one to talk much about his feelings, but with Liara, it was different. She had become so much more than just someone he had rescued. She had become his equal, his partner in this endless fight for survival. I care about you, Liara, he said, his voice low but firm. I care about you more than I ever thought I could care about anyone. Liara's breath caught, and she stepped closer to him, her eyes locked on his. For a moment, the chaos of the universe outside seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them, standing there in the quiet of the ship, their hearts beating in sync. I never thought I would find someone like you, she whispered. In all my years of serving that Excelsior, I thought I had lost everything. But you gave me something I thought was gone forever. Hope. Elias felt a lump form in his throat, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had never been one to speak freely about his feelings, but with Liara, the words just came. You gave me hope too, Liara. Before you came into my life, I didn't know if I could keep going. But you've shown me what it means to fight for something greater than just survival. She reached up, cupping his face with both hands, her touch tender and reassuring. "Then let's fight together. For each other. For a future." Elias leaned in slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the heat between them, the undeniable connection. The war had taken so much from them both, but in this moment, they had something that Excelsior couldn't take away. When their lips met, it wasn't just a kiss. It was the culmination of everything they had been through, the bond they had formed in the fires of war. It was the promise of something more. As they pulled away, Lyra's eyes were shining, filled with a fierce light that Elias had never seen before. "Together," she said, her voice filled with certainty. Elias nodded, his heart full of conviction. Together. And for the first time in a long while, Elias felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They had survived, against all odds. But it wasn't just the war that had changed them. It was the love they had found in the most unlikely of places. As the stars continued to pass outside the ship, Elias knew they weren't just running from the past. They were heading toward a future built on trust, on love, and on the unshakable bond they had forged in the heat of battle. The road ahead was uncertain, but as long as they had each other, Elias knew they could face anything.